Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 3 of concurrent government. So that must mean we're in lesson 3. We are still in module 1, but this week we are concentrating more on the Articles of Confederation. If you haven't noticed yet, there's a lot of overlap in the lessons in module 1. A lot of it is just trying to get us shaped up and ready to really dive deep into American government. But of course, we have to talk about, what has shaped the American identity. We need to talk about the founding documents that have evolved. We have to talk about different various political theories, rule of law, different models of groups, all of the things that really influenced our founding fathers that kind of got us started so that we can move into where we are today. All right. So we're talking about the Articles of Confederation. We talked about this in lesson 2. We talked about, successes and weaknesses. And I mean, there were some successes, and I kind of downplayed them last time. I mean, it did give us a government that saw us through the Revolutionary War. We kind of needed that in order to be taken seriously, right? It allowed us to be able to sign treaties and trade with other countries. It gave us the fair policy for lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. And it did kind of give us secretaries who oversaw the Department of Foreign Affairs, War, Marines, and Treasury. So it kind of gave us a jumping off point, if you will. Unfortunately, those successes were so far outweighed by those weaknesses. The no executive, the no judiciary, the not being able to have a standing military, the no ability to level, federal taxes, the no ability to regulate commerce, fancy word for trade. Those were really kind of the big ones, right? So we're going to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a video on the Articles of Confederation while you guys actually go into, I'm going to click over here, module 1, you're in lesson 3. You're going to click on here where it says notebook. And then for those of you who are new, you're going to click on this link so that you can actually make a copy of your notebook, because that is what you have to turn all of your work in on. Okay. So while you guys are making your copies, I'm going to play the video on the Articles of Confederation, and then we're going to move quickly through the supporting questions, the vocabulary, and the AOC, and then get further into like federalism, etc. All right, so give me just a moment.
Yep, that was the first Constitution of the United States. You're probably wondering how we ended up in this predicament. Let's rewind a bit. British and American soldiers had already been engaging in battles in the Revolutionary War since April of 1775. The United States declared its independence on July 4th, 1776. But in all that time, one important piece of the puzzle was missing: a plan for government for the new country. Around the time the Declaration of Independence was signed in July of 1776, the question of setting up a new government was on the forefront of everyone's minds. A committee of men led by John Dickinson was given the job of drafting a plan for government, which they did, but it took the Continental Congress over a year of debate, discussion, and gathering inspiration from Benjamin Franklin's early plan, called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, before settling on a plan which they called the Articles of Confederation. Delegates agreed it wasn't a perfect plan, but Congress adopted it on November 15, 1777. Now it just needed to be approved. Fun fact: approval by all 13 states was needed before it could be ratified, and it would not be an easy or fast process. Delegates from 8 states ratified it on July 9, 1778, but it wasn't until Maryland finally ratified it on March 1, 1781, that the goal was achieved, over 3.5 years after it had been proposed. The 13 states were very nervous about giving power away to a national government. After all, they were breaking away from Great Britain and the King of England, who they on multiple occasions had called a tyrant, and the states weren't keen on giving any major power to a singular ruler ever again. Thus, the Articles of Confederation set up a weak central government with a single branch, Congress, which was mostly responsible for handling relations with other countries and declaring war as needed. States kept most of the power, which made them happy, but ultimately caused a lot of problems for the young country. Before we talk about the bad news, let's start with the good news. In Congress, each state received 1 vote, making every state equal, regardless of how big their populations were. Congress was given some important powers in the Articles of Confederation. They could manage relations with other countries and Native American tribes, issue money, borrow money, establish the post office, and maintain the armed forces. Now for the bad news. In creating a weak national government, the states had assured a tyrant couldn't rise to power, but that limited power came with other problems. First, agreeing to new laws required agreement by 9 of the 13 states, and approval of changes to the Articles of Confederation itself required agreement by all 13 states. Remember how long it took to approve the document in the first place? Yeah, agreement between the states didn't magically get easier after they won their independence from Great Britain. Additionally, Congress had no power to enforce laws or collect taxes. Yep, let that sink in. States had the power to enforce laws passed by the national government, or not. The national government was too weak to force states to carry out their laws. They could only ask nicely. Likewise, because Congress had no power to collect taxes, the national government didn't have a lot of money, which was a problem because the nation was in debt. The government could ask states for money, but the states were in debt too. States did have the power to tax their citizens, and they did, sometimes too much. The powers given to the national government were so limited, it could do nothing to stop it. Enter Daniel Shays, our friend from the beginning of our story. In 1786 Massachusetts, a storm was brewing. Business owners began demanding payments for goods farmers had bought on credit, and the government began raising taxes at the same time. When farmers couldn't pay their debts, they were arrested or found their farms taken away by the government. Farmers grew angry, and one, Daniel Shays, led a rebellion that escalated on January 25, 1787. On that day, 1,200 farmers marched into Springfield, Massachusetts to seize an arsenal. After a small skirmish, 2 farmers died and 20 were wounded. While the rebellion was short-lived, it shocked the nation because it showed the weaknesses of the national government under the Articles of Confederation. Something had to change if the United States government was going to survive past its early years. In 1787, 12 of the 13 states sent delegates to forge a new document, the United States Constitution, the very framework of the United States government today. Hey everyone, thanks for watching.
All right, so that just kind of takes us through the Articles of Confederation, takes us through what they considered, the strengths, what they considered the weaknesses. And if I can just get this video, there we go. Wasn't doing what I wanted to do. All right, so let's go back to the notebook. So anytime we are going through the notebook, we always have to look at the rubric so you know exactly what it is that I'm going to be grading everything on. So you get to the Module 1, Lesson 3 notebook submission, you scroll down, and you can see the rubric. So you know exactly what I'm going to be looking at. Your supporting question, which comes directly out of those pages, immediately following where you made your notebook, your copy of the notebook. So supporting question is fully written. Copy and paste it straight off of the page, and you're good there. The vocabulary, there are 5 words, and there's 2 parts to this because the chart has 2 sections on it. The left side are the context clues, which come directly from the vocabulary cards in the introduction page. And then the right-hand side are your created definitions, not the Google definition, not the Merriam-Webster definition. How would you define those words based off of what you learned in the context clues? That's 15 points there. The Articles of Confederation, there are 2 questions. And what I'm asking is that you not only answer them correctly, but you answer them in complete sentences. For the Federalist Papers, there are a couple of questions there. Again, answer them correctly and in complete sentences. Because remember, we're always going for the full marks, right? For the U.S. Constitution, you're going to answer those questions correctly and in complete sentences. State versus federal. So now we're looking at, federal powers versus state powers. Completely or correct questions answered in complete sentences. Your primary source analysis, in this case, is going to be Federalist number 45, I believe. There are 8 boxes on that chart. You need to tell me the title with a description. You need to tell me what unit or key concept, what is this about? So what is the kind of the main idea, if you will, of Federalist 45? What are some unique features? Like when you're looking at the primary source, what are some cool, unique things you're seeing? What about some vocabulary? There's always words in there that I'm sure you can find in there. And then you have 3 sections that say, what is this about? Chunk up the primary source into 3 sections and tell me what each section is about. Remember, you are explaining. This is a primary source analysis. I don't want to see it like, half sentences or incomplete sentences or 1 or 2 words. I want to see some actual good analyzing summaries, okay? And then the last part, bring it all together. Now you're in a higher level thinking here, summarizing the entirety of the primary source that you've done. The journal, you're going to answer a question in regards to the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. And in order to get the full 20 points, the full marks, I want 2 full paragraphs. Guys, if you give me 1 paragraph, you're not going to be making more than 80%, because that's not 100%. 100% is 2 full paragraphs, okay? And then finally, supporting the supporting question connection. This is where you answer the supporting question that we put up at the very top of the notebook, okay? That's how you get all of your points. So in the module, let's go to our modules. Each one of these pages is what you use to help you actually answer the questions in the notebook. Don't open up the notebook and then start Googling the questions, because some of you guys are getting those incorrect. This is meant for you to use to answer the questions in the notebook. So we start off on the introduction page. Oops, and I went to the wrong one there. I apologize for that. I accidentally hit lesson 2 instead of lesson 3. Let me scroll down. Oops, to lesson 3. All right, so introduction. So always on the introduction page, we have our supporting question. How did the U.S. Constitution address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? And you literally Control-C, and then in the notebook, you Control-V, and you put it in that first thing right there. How did the U.S. Constitution address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? The next part, you're going to do vocab, context clues on the left, your definition on the right. So coming back over to the page, here's where we find our context clues, right? So the first one, encroach. The great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists of giving giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. And you can shorten that down, or you can use that entire sentence there. And that is what goes on the left-hand side. And then you have to come up with, what does encroachment mean on the right-hand side? So if this is our context clue, what you see right in front of you on the screen, your definition could then be an intrusion on a person's territory or rights. That is where we would give our definition to encroachment. Okay? And you're going to do that with each one of these. So the second word in your vocabulary is inherent. The most frequently used inherent powers are the emergency powers that the president assumes during wartime. And then that right here, this is your context clue. Your personal definition could be powers government has because the government of a nation. Our next word for vocabulary, remember there's always 5 words. Let me see if I can get this over here. Is precedent. Many believe the Constitution must be interpreted in a broad sense to adapt to our current needs, while those who oppose feeling the Constitution must be strictly adhered to use past precedent to deal with current issues. Precedent, right? So we're talking about, from this context clue, our definition could be traditions or standards, right? The word number 4 is ordain. And so literally when we're looking at the preamble in the Constitution, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, as we continue going through, right? Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That means everybody coming behind us. Do ordain and establish this Constitution to the United States of America. That is our context clue. So we could say, for our definition, establish or set, right? And then our 5th word is implied. The inclusion of the elastic clause and the supremacy clause in the Constitution further expanded the power of the federal government by granting Congress implied powers in making legislation and by declaring laws. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, that's the elastic clause. That is a necessary and proper clause. It basically says, because you have powers A, B, and C, you can then have powers over X, Y, and Z, right? So our definition from this context clue could be powers understood to have them because of written powers, right? So there's our vocabulary, right? So now we have on the notebook, we have our context clues on the left. We have our definition on the right, not the Google definition. I say our, the one I came up with. The third section in here is on the Articles of Confederation, which means we then need to go to the next page. So you click next as we're doing this. And you'll notice you'll see Articles of Confederation, Federalist Papers, U.S. Constitution, and State versus Federal. Guys, each one of these tabs is a section in the notebook. So section 3 on the Articles of Confederation, we actually use this section, this tab, to answer those questions in the notebook. So the first question is, what are 3 specific weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation? Guys, there's more than 3, right? There's no president, no federal judiciary, no power to levy taxes, no power to regulate trade, no power to maintain an army. Pick any of those 3. The second one is, do you think the United States could have effectively governed under a unicameral Congress like the one established in the Articles of Confederation? What I said was, having a single Congress probably would not work today for a couple of reasons. Population is much larger and needs more representation. Larger states would not be happy with a single Congress allowing small states to have the same say as them. My thought process on that, and yes, I know these are the same 2 questions that were in your Module 1 Lesson 2 question. I get it. I just realized that, when this got put together, it had that as well. It's an easy one for you guys then, okay? We come back over here, check your understanding. Guys, these questions and the check your understanding actually is what makes the question bank for your quizzes and ultimately the module assessments. So these are really important that you go through these. It says the Articles of Confederation were created primarily in order to create a new national government that would deal with issues such as managing the war. One of the major debates that took place during the writing of the Articles of Confederation was over representation. That's going to be an issue in the Constitutional Convention as well. Some key powers of Congress under the Articles of Confederation: they could declare war, declare peace, and they could send people over for diplomacy. A key problem experienced under the Articles of Confederation is they actually had to rely on unwilling states for tax revenue, because remember, they couldn't tax. And then the last question under this, the success under the Articles of Confederation, is the Northwest Ordinance, and that is bringing in more states, right? And so we've checked all of those. We click finish. And we move on to our next section, which is the Federalist Papers, okay? So now we're talking about, hold on just a second, the group of essays that we kind of, talked a little bit about when we were talking about in lesson 2. So back then, it's obvious they weren't tweeting. There was no televised, broadcasts. They had the delegates. They were getting together. They weren't putting the business all out there for the public. So how did they convince each other? You have to remember, these are a lot of educated men. So writing was a really, really big part of it. So you had people like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay writing a series of essays talking about why we needed a strong federal government, why we needed the Constitution the way it was, why we needed an executive and we needed a judiciary, and why we needed to be able to regulate trade at the federal level, and why we needed what we needed under the Constitution of the United States. And on the other side, we had the anti-federalists, and that would be like John Hancock, Patrick Henry, and James Monroe. And they were all about, no. We don't need this strong central government. We need strong state governments. We need definitely something in the Constitution that really spells out the rights that the people should have and that the rights that the states should have. And we don't want another tyranny. And so the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists wrote essays back and forth to one another and to the people, just trying to get them on their side, if you will, in order to convince each other that that's what they needed to do, was they needed to continue on with what they were doing, right? So what I have is a quick video on the Federalist Papers, and then we're going to come back and we're going to go through some of the rest of these, okay? Give me just a moment.
The Federalist Papers, it's a set of documents written for the New York population who would be voting on ratification. And it happens that these documents were written by 3 of the leading Federalists, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay. In these documents, you have the defense of the Constitution. To read them closely is to read not just why the Federalists thought the Constitution should be ratified, but in some ways, more importantly, you can see how they respond to criticism. The 2 most important issues that the Anti-Federalists raised with the Constitution was, 1, that it didn't go far enough toward direct representation, that it went too far the other direction, towards virtual representation, so that there weren't enough representatives in the House of Representatives, and therefore the voices of many people would be lost. The Federalist Papers have to address this issue. Madison, most famously, addresses, among other things, how a smaller House of Representatives than what the Anti-Federalists wanted could actually be effective, and actually more effective and more democratic than the kind of legislature that the Anti-Federalists would have. The second biggest gripe that the Anti-Federalists had about the Constitution is that there was no Bill of Rights. This made no sense to them. Every state had a Bill of Rights. The English kingdom that they had broken from had a Declaration of Rights that had been the inspiration for the Glorious Revolution, which had filtered into America almost a century before. The Federalists have to respond to this issue. And what you then have, because of this debate, is really the earliest and most fascinating debates in United States history on what are rights, how do you make them or do you make them explicit, how do you protect them, what's the advantage of putting them in writing, what are the disadvantages of putting them in writing. And Madison is fascinated by this topic. He is insistent on not having a Bill of Rights. And here's what sounds counterintuitive, that if you have a Bill of Rights, they will actually be limiting on rights. He worried that if you list rights as the state constitutions, you are bound to forget some. And then the fact that some have been forgotten or neglected will be used to deny those very forgotten rights to people. So reading the Federalist Papers, what you have is a document that exposes this debates. Also, you have to remember, these are pamphlets intended for the common reading public. It's meant to persuade. And therefore, parts of it are actually compelling. Are they boring? Yes, to today's eye, they can certainly be boring in places and address issues and use language that seems antiquated to us. But there are these moments in the Federalist Papers where you realize they speak to us directly today. And that's rather remarkable for a set of documents that is more than 200 years old and written for an audience that could not be more different from Americans today.
All right, so just kind of, explaining a little bit about the differences between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, okay? Let me go back to that page. Hold on. It's making me refresh it again. So we're in the Federalist Papers. We have questions in our notebook in regards to them. So let's go to that. It says, what are two questions you would ask the framers about their interpretation of the law? Explain why you are asking those questions. Two questions I came up with. Why did you give Congress more powers, thus making it the stronger branch? Why did you think that we needed a president? Did they think that this was somehow going to fix the problems under the Articles? Did they feel like Congress would be more representative? Did they feel like we needed a single unifying person to lead the country? Is that why a president? Those could be reasons why, right? The second question, how does the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists clearly spell out the differences in thinking between the founders as they wrote the Constitution? So you have some obvious differences between the Federalist belief in having a strong central government, so 3 branches, provision for changes like amendments, etc., and then the Anti-Federalist belief in having stronger state governments, the Article 4 states' rights that got written into there. Can be seen in the articles written in the Constitution and the addition of a Bill of Rights, okay? We have questions under here, so let's go to the questions. So it says, in Federalist number 51, when Madison argues that the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers of the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachment of the others. He is referring to the constitutions. We're talking about checks and balances, right? Making sure no one, he calls them department, we could also call them branches, becomes too powerful. The next one, it says, read the excerpt from the Federalist number 51. In the passage, what does Madison seem to identify as the greatest threat to good government. And if you are looking in here, and it's really hard for me to point this out while I'm looking at this little tiny thing, but he's talking about human nature. And that is kind of the thing. All government systems sound beautiful on paper. Human nature is going to muck it all up no matter what. Okay. The next question. The series of letters known as the Federalist Papers were written by all of the following except John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, George Washington, good old George. He eventually becomes our first president, but he was not a Federalist. By the way, Federalists and Anti-Federalists are first two political parties, if we're going to look at them as such. The authors of the Federalist Papers argued in favor of the proposed Constitution, saying that it said the system of checks and balances would strengthen democracy and protection for individuals. Creation of a strong Constitution would earn the U.S. international respect. The lack of a formally written Bill of Rights placing controls on the national government. States had proved unable to effectively rule themselves. It was better to have a federal government. They basically said that this system of checks and balances would actually ultimately protect the people. That's why we didn't need the Bill of Rights like the Anti-Federalists were saying we did. Okay. The next section we have is the U.S. Constitution, and it talks about the preamble. And this is like the intro. It starts off with the idea of popular sovereignty, and it hits us really hard with where does the power come from? It's we the people. That's where it comes from. And then it goes on to describe like what are the goals? What are we trying to do? What are the principles in the Constitution? And it says, to form a more perfect union. Are we perfect? No. Are we going to work on it daily? Yes. Are we going to establish justice? Definitely going to try. Are we going to try to ensure domestic tranquility? We are. We're going to fail during the Civil War, but we're going to keep trying. Provide for the common defense. That means we can have a military and protect our borders. Promote the general welfare. Where do you think they were able to stretch the idea that we could have a national healthcare system? Secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So not just the founding fathers, but for every generation coming behind them, that would be us. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So we're setting this, and we're setting this under our religious belief, because ordain does have religious connotations, and we're setting this up. Beyond the preamble, the introduction, there are 7 articles in the Constitution. Okay, and I'm going to show them to you. Let me just go to this one right here. So we know, the introduction is the preamble, and we know that there are 6 principles within it. There's popular sovereignty, we the people. There's limited government or rule of law, that the government has to follow the same laws as the people. We remember this, right? There's separation of powers. There are 3 branches that are independent and distinct. There are checks and balances, so each branch has the power to check the actions of the other 2. There is federalism, this idea that power is going to be divided and shared between the national and regional developments, and judicial review, which is actually going to come about after Marbury versus Madison, and the idea that the courts are going to decide the constitutionality of the actions of the other branches. But there are also 7 articles or sections in the Constitution. Article 1 is all about the legislative branch. Its nickname is Congress, right? It's bicameral. We have the House of Representatives based on population. We have the Senate, which is equal representation. Article 2 is the executive branch, which is the president, the vice president, and all of the executive agencies that are meant to enforce the laws passed by Congress. Article 3 is the judicial branch, and actually the only court specifically mentioned in Article 3 is the Supreme Court. Article 4 talks about states' relations and how the states are going to work together and how they're going to deal with the federal government. It talks about things like extradition. It talks about the full faith and credit clause. Article 5 talks about amending the Constitution. They wanted to make sure that something was in there that talks about how you could formally and informally amend the Constitution. Formal amending of the Constitution is kind of this Garanimals ways. There's this 4 different methods in which you can use. And we've used that 27 times. Well, the first 10 came in the Bill of Rights, and the remaining 17 came after individually. Informal has happened over time. The idea that through tradition, through precedent, changes have been made, but we didn't change the actual language. Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause, and it literally says the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And it talks about Constitution at the very top. Next step down is treaties and acts of Congress. Down from that are the state laws and their constitutions, and finally the local laws, Vegas, Henderson, etc. And then Article 7 is ratification, that it would take 9 of the 13 states in order to ratify the Constitution. This way, because Rhode Island didn't go to the Constitutional Convention, they didn't want them coming back saying, well, I wasn't there and you couldn't do this. And so they kind of spelled it all out. Okay, let me go back to our section. So there's also powers of the government when we're talking about expressed, inherent, and implied powers. We talked a little bit about this in Section 2. Express powers, remember, those are enumerated. Those are the ones that are listed. There's no guessing. We know exactly what each branch can do, even the states. Inherent powers are those powers that especially the president has because he's the president of a country. And then implied powers are those powers that, because of those listed, enumerated, expressed powers, because the government can do A, B, and C, it is implied that we can also do X, Y, and Z, if you will, from that. I've got a quick video on that. So I'm going to play that, and then we'll go back and answer the questions.
Our free retirement planner shows you where you stand.
Hi, everyone. This video is about the powers our Constitution gives the government. After watching this video, you should be able to categorize powers delegated to the national government. Now remember, we have a limited government, which means that the government can only do the things that the Constitution gives it power to do. These powers the government gets from the Constitution are called delegated powers, and there are 3 types of them. They are express powers, implied powers, and inherent powers. We are going to look at express powers first. Express powers are those things that the government can. For our purposes here, you can even think of an express power, but the president is also commander-in-chief of the Air Force. The Constitution doesn't mention the Air Force. It would be weird if it did mention the Air Force. The Constitution was written in the 1780s. Why would it mention the Air Force? But since the Air Force is another branch of the armed forces, the Constitution suggests that the president is commander-in-chief of the Air Force too. Therefore, that is an implied power because it isn't written, but strongly suggested. One of the main sources of the government's implied powers comes from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, which says that the government can make all laws that are necessary and proper. That implies that the government can make laws about issues that might not be directly mentioned in the express powers of the Constitution. In addition to being called the Necessary and Proper Clause, this part of the Constitution is also called the Elastic Clause because it can stretch what the government can do under the framework of the Constitution. Finally, the government also has inherent powers. So it's best to define inherent first. And warning, after I define inherent, I'm going to speak vaguely for a moment, and then I will provide more specific details concerning the government. So consider yourself warned. Inherent means that something is an essential character of something, at least according to my friend Merriam-Webster, and he has yet to let me down. For our purposes here, you can even think about something being inherent as being so necessary that it occurs naturally. For example, you have an inherent right to breathe because you're alive, and that right to breathe occurs naturally. Or you have an inherent right to think because you're a person, and just by being a person, you have that right. Well, our government has inherent powers too, just because it exists. Those inherent powers do not necessarily have to be written in the Constitution, but our government has those powers because it's a government, and all governments have those powers. Examples of inherent powers, powers that all governments have, might be regulating immigration or acquiring territory. Now, you might be able to read parts of the Constitution in ways that implies that the government can regulate immigration or acquire territory, but regardless, our government inherently has those powers because all governments have those powers. So now that you've seen this video, you should be able to define and give some examples of the expressed, implied, and inherent.
Okay, that was pretty much, that was the part that I wanted you to see, because I feel like expressed is very understandable. Implied is pretty understandable. The idea of inherent powers always seems to kind of trip students up. So I just wanted you to see yet another, explanation of that. So let's come to our check our understanding when we're talking about, the U.S. Constitution. So the first question says, how does the Constitution balance between small and large states with regards to legislative power? And we know it's the bicameral nature of Congress, right? We have representation by state, the Senate, and by population, the House of Representatives. The Bill of Rights was not part of the original Constitution. However, it was added in 1791. And it was as a compromise. Remember, the anti-federalists kind of held the Constitution like for ransom and said, listen, it's going to get it in the preamble if we don't see more mention of states' rights, if we don't see more mention of God, and there better be a Bill of Rights added to this sucker, or we are not signing it. Hence, that's why we have all those things now. Amending the Constitution is a difficult process. It becomes increasingly difficult at each step. Why is this so? Well, guys, here's the thing. The Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land, should not be changed without significant consideration and consensus. Congress can actually put forth the idea at the request of the states that they want to add something, but it actually, in order to ratify an amendment, it takes the people in the states in order to agree to it. That's what they mean by significant consideration and consensus. It takes us, we the people, get it? Popular sovereignty. We have to agree to make these changes. It can't just be randomly changed. It's why every time the news goes, oh, the government's going to take away our guns, or oh, the government's going to take away our right to free speech. They can't. The only way they can do that is if they make an amendment to the Constitution, getting rid of the First Amendment's right to speech or the Second Amendment's right to bear arms. And there's not enough states to agree to not only put this forth, but there's not enough states with people in those states who would agree to getting rid of those amendments, okay? The next question that we have is the Constitution grants the federal government 3 types of power, and those are expressed, implied, and inherent, like we just went over. The core purpose of the system of checks and balances is to do what? And that is to basically prevent any one person or branch from becoming too powerful. Again, do you see where, like, the stuff we went through with King George, we're seeing those things being corrected in the Constitution? We're not going to do this kind of way that we did under the Articles, but actually correcting it, right? It says, refer to the table in the Articles of Confederation in the U.S. Constitution. What would be a difference between the two governments? Let's see. Well, we know no judicial branch existed under the Articles, but it did exist under the Constitution. The government under the Articles did not have a large court system. Congress did exist under the Articles of Confederation. They had a Confederation Congress. So we would say state populations were a factor in legislative votes under the U.S. Constitution. That would be the difference between the two. That would be our House of Representatives. Refer to the table. Which sentence would express a similarity between the American governments under the two documents? And it's the only thing that is similar under both is they both had a Congress. And so we have finished that. Let's go to our notebook. And so here's under the US Constitution, we have weaknesses on the left side. And then on the right side, how did they fix this? If it was weak under the AOC, how did they correct that weakness in the Constitution? So no executive under the Articles of Confederation. It was too king-like, right? How did they fix that? They created Article 2 with the creation of the executive branch and the office of the president. A weakness, no federal judiciary. How did they fix it? They created Article 3 with the creation of the judicial branch and the Supreme Court, right? A weakness, no standing army. The states could have their militias, but we had no national standing army. Under Article 1, it allowed for the creation of the national military by Congress. No federal taxes. The states could tax, but we had no federal taxation. Under Article 1, Section 8, it allowed the federal government to lay and collect taxes. And in fact, it's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2. And then a weakness, all states had a single vote. How do we fix that? We created a bicameral Congress, which is the House of Representatives and the Senate. We could do another weakness where any changes or laws had to be by unanimous vote in Congress. How did they fix that? They created a majority plus 1%, 50 plus 1, in order to pass laws, okay? Changes had to be unanimous as in amendments. Any changes to the articles, how did they fix that? Article 5 in the Constitution allowed for the amending of the Constitution, okay? Any one of those things could be in there for how they fix those issues within the Articles of Confederation. The last section in our notebook talks about state versus federal. And so they're talking about federal power and states' rights, and that was a huge, huge issue between the two of them. They want to know, like, how were the states granted powers separate from the federal government? And then what did the 9th and 10th Amendments, like, what did they do? So obviously, Article 1 talks about Congress. Article 2 is the president. Article 3 is the judiciary. Article 4, guys, is the one that talks about the powers that the states have. What kind of powers do they have? Where do their powers lie? And it was the creation of this federal system. And let's see, hang on just a second. I've got kind of another PowerPoint just to kind of give you an idea. Let me go to this. So when we're talking about federalism or federal powers, it's the division of power between the national and the state governments. The national government has express powers that are written out, implied powers that can be assumed, inherent because they're passed down. And we've talked about those express powers that the federal government have, and these are powers that only the federal government has. The states cannot declare war, they cannot coin money, they cannot run the post office, okay? I mean, it's a good thing. Can you imagine if we had, like, I don't know, Nevada nickels and California coins and I don't know, whatever, and then declaring war? I mean, California and Texas would constantly be fighting, and, you know, poor little Nevada would be like caught in the middle. There's implied powers, also known as the elastic clause, that allows them to stretch their powers. Guys, we had no cars back then, so how can they create a national highway system? How can they both first create segregation and then get rid of segregation when that wasn't even a thought process in their head? It's because they can stretch those powers, okay? Or the inherent powers in regards to protecting our borders because we're the government, right? Those are all the things that the federal government has. Article 4 says that the state governments also have powers. Probably the most important amendment in the Constitution is the 10th Amendment, and it's called the Reserved Powers Amendment, and it literally says anything not given to the national government and not denied to the states goes to the states. So there's things like setting speed limits. That is up to the the state governments within their boundaries. Oops, I guess that's where I stopped there. Other things that they have to deal with regards to issues would be like marriage, divorce, birth, death, education in regards to what classes you have to have and what it takes to graduate. Things like that, those are things that are reserved to the states, okay? So let's go to the check your understanding, and then we'll do the questions in our notebook. It says, since the establishment of the U.S. government, state power relative to that of the national government has generally, what? Has it, been impossible to determine? Has it increased? Has it stayed about the same? Has it decreased? Let's check increase. Oh, that's wrong. What is it? It's actually decreased. And I think when this particular page was written, it had decreased, but I want to say in the last 2 to 3 years, we could argue that state powers has actually increased. But, then we'd have to talk about California versus Texas versus Florida, and then it becomes a whole hot mess, right? Power to the people. So we're looking at maintaining a military, talking about regulating foreign trade, reserved or state delegated powers. Oh, they're also talking about driver's license. Concurrent or shared powers. We learned about that last time. So we can both create courts, we can both pass laws and enforce those laws, we can both create and pass taxes, set traffic standards, etc. And then powers denied to both the federal and the state government, and those are what's known as ex post facto laws. They cannot create laws based on things in the past. They cannot levy taxes on exports. We cannot create a royalty, things like that. So it says, according to the visual on the 3 branches of government, an example of a power shared by both the federal and state governments. We're going to go to levy and collect taxes. Now, right here, it talks about administer elections. I know we always think of the presidential election as a national one, but it's actually, there's 51 different ballots. All elections are handled by the states, not the federal government. Okay, and then let's go to our next one. Scroll this down. It says, according to the visual on the 3 branches of state government, a power belonging to the states only is referred to as this kind of power. Is it denied? Is it specified? Is it delegated? Or is it concurrent? Technically it's specified, but I'm almost scared to click on this because I'm not sure if that's how they're going to call it. Nope, they're going to say delegated, I'll bet you. Yep, they're going to say delegated. I've always done delegated as a federal power and specified as a state power, but we're going to go with what this says, and it's delegated. Make sure you guys choose delegated for yours, okay? Because that's going to be a question on your quiz. From where do local governments receive their authority? Is it the Constitution, the states in which they are located? Local governments have no legal authority, or the people? Local governments, it should be the state in which they are located, which, so like, so in Nevada, like Henderson, North Las Vegas, Pahrump, pick a city, they get their powers from the state that they're located in. In Las Vegas, we don't get our power from California or Arizona. We get it from Nevada, if that makes sense, hopefully. The original form of democratic government in America began in county governmental structures during the colonial era, state constitutions formed during the colonial era. Earliest years after the U.S. Constitution was ratified, New England town meetings. Well, they weren't really state constitutions. They were more colonial constitutions, but I'm assuming this is where they're going with this one. No, it's not where they're going with this one. So they're saying the New England town meetings, which if you look at some of the town charters that were created, a lot of state constitutions kind of took that and ran with it. And in fact, today's state constitutions are actually generally longer and much more involved than even the United States Constitution. Talking about the 9th and 10th Amendments, the 10th Amendment protects which of the following from an all-powerful federal government? So when you look, it says to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So we're going to go the states and the people because we're part of them, right? How does the 10th Amendment to the Constitution limit the power of the federal government? Does it place limits, upper limits on salaries? Does it prevent the federal government from passing tax laws? Does it reserve all unspecified powers to the states and the people? Or does it prevent the federal government from entering in treaties? It's this one right here. Remember, we said anything not granted to the federal government nor denied the states is reserved to the states and their people respectively. And then I think we're done with that one. So let's go back to the questions in the notebook. So when it talks about how are the states granted powers separate from the federal government, Article 4 and Amendment 10 grants all powers not explicitly granted to the federal government nor denied the states or solely of the states. What do the 9th and 10th Amendments guarantee? The 9th Amendment gives powers to the people and the 10th gives powers to the states. And then the last section, so when we're in here, and this is something else that has come up as well, when you click next, you will notice that the next page that we have in here actually says primary source analysis, Articles of Confederation, under here, but that's not the name of the primary source, but it tells you that this is where the primary source is located. So we click in here and it is Federalist number 45, alleged danger from the powers of the Union to the state governments considered. And this one was written by James Madison. And he wrote it to the people originally of the state of New York. So when we're looking at this, our title and description, the title, Federalist number 45, the description, Madison's essay stating that the Constitution as written allows for the balance of power between the states and federal government. The concept or the unit is ratifying the Constitution. That's what it's about. The unique features, it was an essay originally written to the people of New York, and then it was added to the collective of essays written to convince the anti-federalists to ratify the Constitution. I picked 2 vocabulary words, and there's like a ton of vocab in our Federalist number 45. I did American Confederacy and Lycian Confederacy. Lycian, we're talking about way back once upon a time when we're talking about the Lycians, and it's a city-state when we're talking about in Greece and all of that kind of stuff. And basically, the Lycian Confederacy talks about a federal model and representative government. And so what I did is I literally kind of chunked Federalist number 45. We have our first section, and we have our second section, and then kind of a third section if you want. However you want to chunk this up, you're just going to have to do at least 3 sections of it. So for me, I said, you know, in the first section, Madison recognizes the question of whether or not the states lose power. And he says, no, they don't lose power under the Constitution. It's the federal government's job to protect the people of the country from foreign nations and to provide security. The next section I talk about is he brings up the idea of the abuses of kings, relating smaller states' powers to those of small kingdoms. He basically calls the states like little fiefdoms, and says that the way they treated their people without having a federal government to help them kind of is like that idea. And while states work for the good of their own people, they do not meet the good of all the people in the country, and therefore we need a federal government. And then the last section I talk about is he concludes that the states will not lose power within the larger federal government of the United States. And he compares it to the Lycian Confederacy, which was a very, very early model of a federal union and a representative government. He's like, it worked for them, we can make it work for us. And then my bringing it all together, the summary, in Federalist 45, Madison argues that the union as outlined in the Constitution is necessary to the people's happiness, and that the balance of power between the states and the national government will support the greatest happiness for all of the people, okay? So we come back to the canvas, we click next, and it takes us to the information in regards to what we're gonna write for our journal entry. And we're talking about, should the interpretation of the United States Constitution evolve over time? So it talks about, how they got together in 1787, how the US Constitution was created through several compromises, and that in order to create a document that would actually endure centuries, the wording of the document is intentionally vague. The main principles of the Constitution relied upon the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers. How strong or valid would the US Constitution be if it had been amended hundreds of times? Scholars believe that the writers of the Constitution were intentionally vague so their written word would last for generations. Our government has only been amended 27 times since its ratification in 1788. So you need to think about that in regards to many other countries who have had constitutions are on like their 3rd or 10th. Some are even on like their 20th constitution, and their original one was created after ours. So ours has really endured the ages, right? Over 200 years. So the question prompt is, should our interpretation of the United States Constitution evolve over time? And so in your journal entry in the notebook, you need to give me 2 full paragraphs in order to get full credit answering that question. Should it evolve over time? Yes or no? And then explain and give examples. Be specific. All right. And then the next part that we have is answering the supporting question in our notebook. You need to give me a complete paragraph answering this question. How did the US Constitution address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? Literally take 3 weaknesses if you want, and answer each of those weaknesses with how they fixed it in the Constitution, and you've got at minimum 5 sentences for your first paragraph. They created 3 branches that all would have separate powers, but they would check and balance each other out. They created a bicameral legislative body to address the needs of smaller and larger states. They gave states themselves actual powers in Article 4. They created a Bill of Rights to answer all of the issues that we had and rights that had been taken away under Parliament and King George, and they put them back into there. And they maintained this idea of rule of law, that the states would have to follow the same laws as the citizens of their states, and that if people had problems with their states, they actually had a federal government to go to, and that the federal government also had to follow the laws that the people of the country had to follow. Okay, any and all of those things, 5 full sentences. And then the last part of this is a review for the vocabulary. And it just says, drag the words into the correct boxes. It says, he says that the government will set a dangerous blank if it refuses to allow protesters to hold a rally. And it is a precedent. If I can get it to go in there. The first one always have a hard time with that one. So I can get it in there. There we go. Kindness is not a random act, but a full-time commitment, a respect for others and their blank dignity, their inherent dignity. Each year, the sea continues to blank upon the island's beaches. It encroaches. People of the United States do ordain and establish the Constitution by ordering it to the law. If I can just get that to fit in there. And then following his words to the officer were implied a threat, right? So we've finished the vocabulary. Within the lessons and recordings page is the Module 1 Lesson 3 quiz review, which is all the things that we just did in the pages. You have the quiz review on that page. Obviously, this video and then any other videos, if I make them this week, will go in there as well. And then for my honors class, just as an FYI, regular concurrent, you don't have to do this, but honors concurrent, you do have an Articles of Confederation tombstone where you are literally going to create a tombstone about the Articles of Confederation. And that is it for Module 1, Lesson 3. We've covered the rubric. We've covered all the questions. We've done some videos. And I think that is it. I don't think there's anything else that we have. Again, remember, Monday from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m., MVLA S. Rather number 9, the number 9, is our group meet. If you want to come in, if you have questions, you need some help, as always, that live meet on Monday is optional. And that's it, guys. I hope you have a great week 3. If you need any help, send me a message through Remind Text, through Canvas messaging, through email, or pop in on Monday's live meet. And I think we're done for the night. Have a good week, guys. Bye.